The chair at the kitchen table told the whole story. There had been 4 of them once. A set her husband Gerald had picked out at an estate sale in the summer of 1987, solid oak, the kind of furniture built by people who expected it to outlast them. It had. Gerald hadn't. The other 3 chairs had gone to the second-hand shop on Meridian Street in January when the heating bill arrived, and Winifred Alcott stood at the kitchen counter doing the same arithmetic she'd been doing every month since the warehouse closed, the kind of arithmetic where every column led to the same answer, which was not enough. She kept one chair because you had to sit somewhere. People called her Freddie, had called her that since the 3rd grade when a teacher named Mrs. Patton had looked at the name Winifred on her attendance sheet and said quietly and without discussion that she'd be calling her Freddie, and Freddie had been fine with that because Winifred was a name that belonged to old photographs, and she had been 8 years old and very much alive. The name had followed her across 6 decades, through the warehouse, through Gerald's illness, through the years of raising Bryn alone after the diagnosis, then through the years after which were a different kind of alone entirely. 63 years old, 25 years managing inventory and logistics at Midland Distribution on Route 9, the kind of work that asked for precision and reliability and gave back a paycheck in a parking spot. She had been good at it in the way that people are good at things they understand completely, the systems, the weights, the way everything in a warehouse moves according to logic if you know how to read it. She had learned to read it before some of her younger colleagues had learned to drive. The facility had closed in March, not because anything was wrong with it, because a spreadsheet somewhere assembled by people who had never walked its floor had determined that the same work could be done cheaper 2 states away. The severance check lasted 11 weeks. The unemployment benefits covered rent and utilities with nothing left over for things like replacement window seals or the rear left tire that was slowly going soft. 38 job applications in 6 months. She kept them in a notebook the same way she had kept inventory records, methodical, dated the outcome noted in the right column. 38 outcomes in that column, and none of them were the ones she needed. Bryn called on alternating Sundays now. It used to be every Sunday. Before that, it had been every few days, the easy rhythm of a mother and daughter who had learned to talk through the hard years and had kept the habit after things got easier. Then Bryn's career in pharmaceutical sales had accelerated, and the calls had shortened, and the time between them had lengthened, and Freddie had learned to treat each call as its own complete thing rather than a piece of something continuous. It was better that way. Expecting continuity was just a mechanism for measuring loss. She understood. Bryn had gotten out of Millington, Indiana, the way Freddie had always hoped she would, with her whole self pointed towards something larger. You didn't do that by standing still. Freddie had raised her daughter to move forward. She just hadn't anticipated how thoroughly the lesson would take. The county fair had been running for 93 years. It occupied the field behind Millington High School every September, which meant that Freddie had attended it in some form or another for most of her life. First as a child running between booths, then as a parent navigating the same terrain with a small, determined Bryn who had opinions about the direction of travel, then as a warehouse employee who bought raffle tickets out of habit and loyalty to the volunteer fire department, and now as a woman with $11 in her pocket who went because it was something to do, and the days had developed an uncomfortable abundance of hours since March. She wore her good coat, the wool one that still fit right that Gerald had bought for her the Christmas before his first diagnosis, that she had maintained with the same attention she gave to anything she wanted to keep. Presentation was not vanity. Presentation was telling the world you still thought yourself worth the effort. Floyd Hutchkins was at the fire department booth, the same spot he occupied every September. The same wide smile he'd had since his retirement 5 years earlier, when the pension had settled over him like a warm coat of his own. Floyd had worked the warehouse too in another department, and he waved at Freddie with the easy enthusiasm of a man who had nowhere to be and was sincerely delighted about it. $1 a ticket, 5 for $5. He gestured at the prize board behind him, grill from Randy Kowalski, a quilt from Betty Marsh, and the grand prize listed at the top in letters that had been printed to convey significance: the Keswick Farm on rural Route 12. 40 acres, house and barn, deed included. Freddie looked at the prize board for a moment. She knew the Keswick Farm the way everyone in Millington knew it from the outside, at distance glimpsed through a car window on the drive past. Virgil Keswick had died 5 years ago, a heart attack, the official version. The less official version, the one that circulated at Patsy's diner over coffee, was that he had simply run out of reasons to continue, which was not a medical category, but was understood locally as a meaningful one. He had lived alone on that property for decades. No family had come forward. The land had passed to the county, and the county had apparently decided that the most expedient way to deal with 40 acres of declining farmland and a house that had been declining along with it was to donate it to this year's raffle as the grand prize, which had the dual advantage of appearing generous and requiring no effort. The farm was not an attractive prize. Everyone knew this. It was the kind of knowing that circulated without being stated directly, present in the quality of the pause, when the farm was mentioned in the polite vagueness with which it was described. 40 acres of overgrown fields. A farmhouse that had been inhabited by one man who had stopped maintaining it sometime in the last decade of his life. A barn that was visibly losing its argument with gravity. Freddie stood at the booth and looked at the prize board. She had $11 in her pocket and a heating season coming and a notebook with 38 entries in the outcome column, and she thought about the arithmetic she did every month, and she handed Floyd $5. He gave her 5 tickets with numbers in faded blue ink. "Good luck, Freddie. Maybe you'll win that farm. Fix it up nice." She smiled because it was expected, pocketed the tickets, walked away. The drawing happened at 6 after the pie judging and before the fireworks. Freddie had planned to leave before then. The plan disintegrated somewhere between the craft booths and the 4-H displays, not from desire, but from the specific inertia of a woman who had nowhere to be and had stopped finding the apartment welcoming. She sat on a bench near the parking lot as the light went golden, and families with tired children moved in the purposeful way of people who had a destination. The announcer's voice came over the speaker with the particular enthusiasm of a man who had been performing civic enthusiasm for several decades. And the grand prize winner is ticket number 47219. Winifred Alcott. The name took a moment to register as hers. She checked the ticket with hands that felt briefly unfamiliar. The last number matched. She had won. The walk to the stage was longer than it should have been. People turned to look as she approached the specific attention that assembles around unexpected outcomes. The announcer, a man named Jerry Stokes, who ran the feed store and had the face of a person who enjoyed a good story, grinned broadly and held up a manila envelope. There was applause. Underneath the applause, she heard it. She had spent 25 years in a warehouse learning to hear the sounds underneath. Other sounds, the subtle shift that told you a load was settling wrong, the specific vibration that preceded a mechanical failure. She heard it now. The undercurrent of the crowd, the brief laughter from somewhere in the back, the murmur that was not unkind but was not nothing either. Poor old woman, it wasn't said loudly, it didn't need to be. She took the envelope from Jerry Stokes and shook his hand and said thank you and walked off the stage and through the crowd into her car, and she sat in the parking lot while the fairgrounds emptied and the fireworks went up, and she looked at the envelope in her lap with the particular composure of a woman who has spent 63 years learning not to show the things that cost her. After the fireworks ended and the last car had left the field, she opened the envelope. Inside a deed, a key ring with 3 keys and a property tax statement showing the current year paid. The deed had her name on it. The land was hers. She sat with that for a while. Then she drove home. The next morning she drove to rural Route 12. The driveway was almost invisible, choked with the kind of growth that accumulates when no one has been telling it what to do. Saplings had established themselves in the gravel. Tall grass closed in on both sides and branches from overgrown hedges scraped the sides of the car as she eased forward. The farmhouse appeared gradually through the overgrowth, the way things appear when they have been patient about being found. 2 stories. White clapboard that had weathered past white into the gray of old bones. Shutters hanging at the particular angles that come from years of being adjusted by wind rather than intention. A front porch that had developed a pronounced sag toward the center, as though it had been considering sitting down for some time and had finally made its decision. The barn stood 50 yards back, listing to one side in the companionable way of old structures that have decided compromise is preferable to collapse. Freddie parked and sat with the engine off for a moment. She was 63 years old, and she had driven to an overgrown driveway in rural Indiana to look at a property she had won with $5 worth of raffle tickets, and the practical part of her mind was already running in the numbers. already estimating, already translating what she saw into categories of problem and cost. But there was another part of her, the part that had managed inventory for 25 years, the part that had learned to look at what was actually there rather than what should have been there. And that part was looking at the farmhouse with a different kind of attention. The roofline was intact. The foundation stones visible along the base of the house looked solid in the way of things built a century ago by people who intended them to last. The chimney stood straight. The porch was rotten, yes, but porches could be rebuilt. Windows could be replaced. Siding could be stripped and refinished. These were cosmetic failures, which was a different category entirely from structural failure. The bones were good. She had heard Gerald say that about a car once years ago when she had thought he was being unreasonably optimistic about something that looked past saving. He had been right. It had run for another 4 years. Freddie opened the car door and got out. The air smelled of damp earth and the particular green smell of things growing without interference. The smell of land that has been left to its own conclusions. After 6 months in an apartment that smelled of the neighbors cooking and the industrial cleaning product the building manager used in the stairwells, the smell of the open air moved through her like something she hadn't known she was missing. She tested the porch steps before trusting them. The far left corner where the porch attached to the house and the structural support was still intact held her weight without complaint. She worked along the edge and reached the front door. The lock gave on the second key. The smell inside was what she expected: mildew and old wood and the specific quality of air that has been still for years. Not the smell of something rotting, the smell of something waiting. There is a difference, emerged. She stood in the front room and let her eyes adjust. Furniture still in place, sheeted with dust. A sofa with cushions that had taken on the permanent shape of someone no longer there. A kitchen through a doorway with the deep soapstone sink she recognized from old farmhouses and the specific arrangement of someone who had organized a space for solitary occupation. Everything within arm's reach, everything positioned for efficiency rather than company. She moved through the room slowly, the way she moved through a new warehouse floor on her first day getting the layout. Understanding the logic, reading the space, the way a space can be read if you pay attention to what it tells you about the person who organized it. Upstairs, 2 bedrooms and a bathroom with a tub on feet. In the smaller bedroom, a desk pushed against one wall. She opened the drawers. The first 2 were empty. The third stuck, and she worked it open with the patience of someone who has learned that stuck drawers are just drawers with more friction, not locked doors. Inside was a journal. Leather-bound, the cover worn soft from years of handling, thick with use. She carried it downstairs to the kitchen, where the light was better, and she set it on the counter and stood there looking at it for a moment before she opened it. The handwriting was precise. Every letter carefully formed the penmanship of someone who understood that words were worth the effort of legibility. The first entry was dated March 15th, 1995. Started today on what might be the most important work of my life. They'll say I'm crazy. They already do. But I know this can work. The mathematics are sound. The principles are solid. What I lack in formal credentials, I make up for in stubbornness and time. Plenty of both. Freddie read it standing at the counter. Then she pulled the single chair from the kitchen table and sat down and kept reading. She read for 2 hours. The man who wrote this journal had spent 30 years alone on this land, working on something that the people around him had decided without investigation was not worth their attention. He wrote about his work with the specific passion of someone who has given their life to a thing and knows in whatever part of themselves that processes such knowledge that the thing is worthy of it. He wrote about setbacks with the pragmatism of someone accustomed to them. He wrote about small victories with a restraint that made them more affecting than celebration would have been. One entry stopped her. September 2003. Went to town today for supplies. Charlie at the hardware store gave me that look again. The one that says he thinks I'm wasting my time. Maybe I am. But when you've been laughed at as long as I have, you learn to use it as fuel. They laughed at me in school. They laughed when I told them I could fix anything. They're still laughing now that I'm trying to build something that matters. Let them laugh. I'll keep working. Freddie set the journal on the counter. She looked around the kitchen. At the old appliances at the counter, worn smooth by decades of use, at the window above the sink that looked out over the overgrown fields. Outside, the morning light was moving across the land. The way light moves when there is nothing to stop it, steady and unremarkable, and transforming everything it touched. She had heard that laugh last night. She had heard it when her name was called, and someone in the back of the crowd had found it funny that a 63-year-old woman had won something worthless. She had walked through it the way you walk through weather because you have to, and because there is no alternative, and because the direction you are walking matters more than the discomfort of the walking. Virgil Keswick had walked through the same weather for 30 years. And he had written about it from inside a farmhouse that no one else thought was worth entering, and kept working and kept writing, and the work was somewhere in this house, and the man who had done it was gone. She picked up the journal again, turned to the last entry. November 2019. The handwriting was different, not worse, but slower, each letter formed with more effort, as if the pen were heavier than it used to be. So tired now. The work is nearly done, but I'm running out of time. Can feel it in my bones. The way winter feels when you have lived through enough of them. If I don't finish, someone else will have to. The plans are all here. The pieces are all here. Just need someone who believes enough to put them together. That's all any of us need. Really. Someone who believes. Freddie closed the journal carefully. She sat in the chair that was the only chair at the kitchen table and looked at the room around her, at the dust and the settled silence and the objects that a man had lived among for decades. And she thought about the apartment on Belden Street with its one chair and its 38 notebook entries and the heating bill coming in October. And she thought about the journal in her hands, about the voice inside it, about a man who had worked alone for 30 years on something that everyone around him had decided was not worth their attention, who had died 5 years ago in this house, still working on it, who had written at the end, someone who believes. She called Bryn that evening. Bryn answered on the fourth ring, the distracted tone of someone in the middle of something she considers more important than a phone call from her mother. "Hey, Mom, what's up?" "I want a farm," Freddie said. A pause. "What? At the county fair? I want a farm, 40 acres on Route 12. I'm going to move here." The conversation that followed was not a conversation. It was Bryn expressing concern in the vocabulary she used for expressing concern, which was efficient and organized and made all the reasonable points in the correct order. She was worried. She thought it was impulsive. She wanted Freddie to focus on finding work. She asked whether the property had been inspected, whether there were liability concerns, whether Freddie had considered what it would mean to live alone in a rural property without reliable infrastructure. Freddie let her talk. When Bryn finished, Freddie said, "I'll call you when I'm settled." There was a pause on the line. "Then this seems really impulsive, Mom. I know it does," Freddie said. "Good night, Bryn." She moved in on a Tuesday. Her entire life fit into the back of her 12-year-old sedan in one trip. 3 boxes of clothes, a box of kitchen supplies, a box of books, and the things she hadn't been willing to leave behind, which included Gerald's watch and the photographs from the years when all 4 chairs had been in use. A duffel bag with her laptop and her notebook with its 38 entries. She carried the last box in from the car and set it on the living room floor and stood in the silence of the house with the late afternoon light coming through the windows at the particular angle that turned dust motes into something almost beautiful. She spent the first day cleaning. The work had a quality she had almost forgotten, purposeful, incremental, measurable. You could see where you had been. The floor showed progress. The windows let in more light by evening than they had in the morning. The kitchen counter, scrubbed down to its original surface, turned out to be a warm pine that had been beautiful once and could be beautiful again. That night, she slept on the air mattress she'd inflated in the upstairs bedroom, and the house spoke to her in the language of old wood, the small conversations between timber and temperature, the specific creak of a structure that has been settling for decades and has strong opinions about weight distribution. In the apartment, the silence had been the silence of isolation. Here the silence had layers. It had depth. She lay on the air mattress and listened to it and found it surprisingly a comfort. The second morning she went back to the barn. She had been circling it since the day before, the way you circle a thing that you know is important before you are ready to address it directly. The main doors were secured with a padlock rusted to the color of old blood. She tried the keys from the ring. The third one fit. The lock required persuasion, but it opened. She pulled the doors wide and stood in the opening. The barn was larger inside than it appeared from outside. Concrete floor, Old hay bales along one wall, a tractor in the corner under decades of dust, tools on pegboards, their outlines visible beneath the cobwebs, the accumulated equipment of a working farm that had slowly stopped working. At the back, behind a wall of hay bales that had been positioned with obvious intention, she found another door, a different padlock. Newer. None of her keys fitted. She looked at the lock. She looked at the door. She went back to the main barn and found a heavy wrench in a tool cabinet that hadn't been touched in years, and she returned to the door and she hit the lock 3 times the way you hit something you need to open, because there is no other option, because the arithmetic has run out of alternatives. The third strike broke it. The door opened inward on silence and darkness, and she stood on the threshold and clicked on the flashlight she'd had the presence of mind to bring from the house, and she swept the beam across the space beyond. She had spent 25 years in a warehouse. She had spent those years learning to read the contents of a space to understand what was organized and what was not, what had been placed with intention and what had been left in disorder, what the arrangement of objects said about the person who had arranged them. The workshop beyond that door had been organized by someone who cared about their work and way other people care about their children. 3 walls of workbenches, each surface ordered with the specific logic of someone who knew exactly where each tool was in the dark. Blueprints on every wall, dozens of them, drawn with a precision that was itself a form of argument. Here is how carefully I have thought about this, the drawing said. Here is what serious work looks like. And in the center of the room on the primary workbench, covered with a canvas tarp that had gathered the dust of years, something. Freddie walked toward it slowly. The flashlight beam moved across the tarp, across the workbenches, across the walls, covered in meticulous drawings. She could feel her heart doing something unusual in her chest, the physical response to a situation the body recognizes before the mind catches up. She reached out, took the edge of the tarp in both hands, and pulled. What was underneath was beautiful. Not beautiful the way decorative things are beautiful. Beautiful the way functional things are beautiful when they have been made by someone who understood that function and care are not opposites, that you can build something to work and build it as though it matters, because it does. Copper coils wound with the precision of something measured in fractions of millimeters. Metal components fitted together with the patience of someone who measured success not in hours, but in the accumulation of correct decisions. It was incomplete. She could see that. Wires hung loose from certain sections. Areas were clearly missing components. But the craftsmanship in what existed was extraordinary. The work of someone who had given it everything they had and had stopped only because they ran out of time. She stood in the workshop for a longer time. The flashlight beam moved across the blueprints on the walls. Technical drawings, dense with notation covering what appeared to be an energy conversion system of some kind. She didn't have the vocabulary for the specifics yet, but 25 years of reading warehouse specifications and equipment manuals had given her the foundational literacy to recognize when something was genuinely engineered versus when something was the product of wishful thinking. This was not wishful thinking. This was the product of 30 years of a person applying everything they had to a single problem and getting closer by painful degrees to solving it. At the top of the central blueprint, in the same precise handwriting as the journal, Keswick Energy Converter Prototype A. Freddie looked at the device, at the blueprints, at the workshop that had been sealed and waiting behind a hay bale wall in a barn that everyone in Millington had driven past without stopping. She thought about the last journal entry. Just need someone who believes enough to put them together. She turned off the flashlight and stood in the dark for a moment. Then she turned it back on, walked to the nearest workbench and pulled a stool from underneath it and sat down, and she began methodically to read the blueprints that Virgil Keswick had left on the wall for whoever came after. She read for 3 hours. By the time she walked back to the farmhouse in the early afternoon with the light going gold over the overgrown fields, she had not made any decisions. She had simply looked carefully at what was in front of her, the way she had always looked at things that required understanding before action. What was in front of her was a device that an exceptional man had built alone over 30 years, that was nearly finished, and that had been waiting behind a door in a barn that nobody had bothered to open because everybody had already decided without looking what was inside. She knew something about that. She made coffee in the farmhouse kitchen and sat at the table with a single chair and the journal and the light coming through the cleaned windows, and she did what she always did when she was trying to understand something important. She started from the beginning, and she read. The journal became her textbook. Freddie read it the way she had read equipment manuals in her warehouse years, not for pleasure, not in the passive way of someone absorbing a story, but with a pencil in her hand and a yellow legal pad beside her, stopping at every technical passage to write down what she understood and mark what she didn't. Virgil had written the journal for himself, which meant he had assumed a reader who could follow his thinking without explanation. Freddie was not always that reader, but she had learned over 25 years of managing systems she hadn't designed that the gap between not understanding and understanding was bridged by one thing: staying in the chair. She stayed in the chair. The blueprints on the workshop walls became a separate curriculum. She photographed each one with her phone on the first full day she spent in the workshop, crouching, standing on the stool, angling the phone to capture every notation in the margins, and printed copies at the Millington Public Library for 30 cents a page, which was money she could account for. She spread the copies across the kitchen table in the order that made sense to her, the order that told the story of the device from its conceptual foundation to its most recent incomplete state. And she ate her meals standing at the counter so the table could remain a working surface. The library became a second resource. The librarian, a quiet woman in her 60s named Doris, had the particular gift of people who have spent their careers connecting other people with information. She asked no questions about why a woman Freddie's age wanted books on electromagnetic induction and energy conversion systems. She simply pulled them from the shelves in the interlibrary loan system with the calm efficiency of someone for whom no request was strange. Freddie read them in the evenings. She cross-referenced them against Virgil's notes. She made lists of terms she needed to define before the surrounding sentences would yield their meaning. The work was slow and the slowness was not comfortable, but she had managed inventory long enough to understand that the pace of a job is set by the job itself, not by the person doing it, and that the only productive response to that reality is patience. Fritz Kellerman's hardware store occupied a building on the main block of Millington that had started its life as something else. The ceilings were too high, the floor plan too irregular, and had been a hardware store for as long as anyone currently living could remember, which was the kind of continuity that gave a place a specific gravity. It smelled of sawdust and machine oil, and the particular dry smell of packaged fasteners. It smelled like work. Fritz himself was a man in his mid-60s with reading glasses on a chain and the careful movements of someone who had spent decades in proximity to things with edges. He looked up when Freddie came in on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after she had moved to the Keswick farm, and recognition crossed his face. "Heard you won the Keswick place," he said. "That's right. How's it working out?" She had rehearsed her answer to this question, or rather, she had noticed herself rehearsing it without deciding to which men it mattered more than she intended to show. "It's a project," she said, "keeping me busy." Fritz nodded slowly, the kind of nod that said he had heard the real answer underneath the stated one and respected the decision to state a different one. She asked about work, part-time, whatever he had, inventory and shipping and general labor. He studied her for the length of time it takes to make a decision you intend to stick to. Then he told her 3 days a week, 6 hours a day. The pay was modest, but there was an employee discount. She said that worked. He said Monday at 8. She did not thank him effusively. He would not have wanted that. She said thank you and meant it and left, and she sat in her car outside for a moment, feeling something she recognized as relief, which had a physical component she had forgotten, a specific loosening in the chest, like a tension that had been structural, finally releasing. The employee discount was the point. Not primarily the paycheck, though the paycheck mattered. The discount meant she could buy the components she needed, the ones on the list she had assembled from Virgil's blueprints, and his notes, the ones she had priced at the library's computer and found to be exactly as expensive as she had feared. She could buy them gradually, 1 or 2 items a week, the way you move a large weight by deciding not to think about its total mass and focusing instead on the next handhold. She started on the device the same week she started at the hardware store. The approach she used was the approach she had used in warehouses when she inherited a system someone else had built and needed to understand it before she could maintain it or improve it. You did not begin by changing things. You began by learning what was there. She documented the existing state of the device, photographed every component from every relevant angle, mapped the connections that existed against the blueprints that showed the connections that should exist, cataloged the gaps between what was and what was intended. It was the kind of work that felt like preparation rather than progress. But Freddie had long since made her peace with the fact that preparation was progress, just the kind that didn't look like anything yet. Virgil's workshop was organized with the logic of a mind that thought in systems. Every drawer in the workbench had a label, and the label described not just the contents, but the purpose of the contents, not just wiring, but wiring secondary current loop, not main supply. Every tool had a position, and the position told you something about how often it was used and in what sequence. Reading the workshop was like reading a manual that had been written in 3 dimensions, and Freddie was good at reading manuals. She worked in the evenings, and on the days she wasn't at the hardware store, the afternoons still long enough in October to give her useful light before she had to switch to the work lamps she had found stored in a cabinet near the door. The temperature in the workshop dropped as the season progressed, and she wore her good coat and layered underneath it and kept a thermos of coffee on the corner of the workbench and worked with the methodical focus that had always been more available to her when the world outside was cold and still. Phyllis Drexel arrived on a Saturday morning at the end of October. She came up the driveway slowly in a truck that had seen decades of use without seeing much maintenance, and she moved from the cab to the porch with the careful deliberateness of a woman who knew her joints and had a working arrangement with them. White hair pinned back, a cardigan over a flannel shirt, a covered dish in her hands, and the expression of someone who has decided to introduce herself and has thought about how to do it. "I live about 2 miles down the road," she said. "We've been neighbors for a month and I haven't come to say hello, and that's not right." Freddie made coffee. They sat at the kitchen table. Freddie had acquired a second chair from the Salvation Army in Hartfield, and Phyllis looked around the kitchen with eyes that remembered it differently. She had known Virgil for 30 years, she said. Not intimately, the way you know someone who lives nearby and operates in the same small world. Her husband Clarence had helped him sometimes with metalwork. Virgil would come over with drawings with questions about how to shape particular pieces, and Clarence had enjoyed the problem solving and had never asked too deeply what the problems were in service of. "What was he like?" Freddie said. Phyllis considered the question with the honesty of someone who doesn't offer comfort at the expense of accuracy. "Brilliant," she said, "kind in a quiet way. Terribly lonely, I think, though he never complained about it. People in town thought he was strange. Maybe he was, but strange isn't the same as wrong. Did he ever talk about his work sometimes? Making something that could help people, he said once. Making something that would prove he'd done something worthwhile." She looked at Freddie directly, the frank assessment of someone who has earned the right to ask. "You found his workshop, didn't you?" It was not a question. Freddie said yes. "Are you going to finish it?" The question sat in the kitchen air between them. Through the window, the overgrown field showed the gray-brown of late October, the season doing what it always did, removing everything that was not essential. "I'm trying to understand it," Freddie said. "Whether I can finish it, I don't know yet." Phyllis was quiet for a moment. Then she said Virgil died thinking it was all for nothing, that he'd wasted his life on something nobody would ever see or care about. She reached across the table and briefly placed her hand over Freddie's. "You prove him wrong, and you'll give an old man the peace he never got to feel while he was alive." Before she left, Phyllis wrote her phone number on a piece of paper. "My late husband's workshop is still in our barn," she said. "Tools, equipment, some specialized things he collected. You need something, you come and look. Virgil helped us more times than I could count. The least I can do is make sure someone helping him has what they need." After Phyllis's truck disappeared back down the driveway, Freddie stood on the porch for a long moment in the cold air. The farm stretched in every direction, the barn with its workshop at the far edge of the clearing, the fields going to seed in the particular way of land that has been released from obligation. She thought about what Phyllis had said, about a man dying without knowing, about the specific quality of that kind of ending. She went back to the workshop. 6 weeks after moving onto the farm on a Tuesday morning, when the overnight frost had left the clearing white and the air carried the smell of the coming season, Freddie was organizing a cabinet in the far corner of the workshop when she noticed the back panel. It didn't sit flush. There was a gap along the right edge, a few millimeters, the kind of inconsistency that would be invisible if you weren't paying the kind of attention that 25 years of warehouse management teaches as a reflex. She pressed on the panel. It flexed. She pressed harder, and it moved inward, and when she pulled it forward, a metal lock box dropped from behind it and hit the concrete floor with a sound like a decision. The box was heavy, secured with a combination lock. She tried numbers from the journal the year Virgil had bought the farm, the year he had begun the work sequences that had appeared in his writing. Nothing worked. She set it on the workbench and went back to the journal and read it again, not looking for numbers, but listening for the cadences of what mattered most to the man who had written it. He had mentioned his mother once in an entry from 2001. She believed in me when no one else did. Her birthday was the one day I always stopped working. Freddie found the entry, read it carefully. The birthday was mentioned in passing February 14th, 1921. She converted it to a 6-digit number, entered it into the lock. The mechanism released. Inside the box were letters, organized in chronological order, each bundle secured with a rubber band that had dried and stiffened with age. Freddie carried the box to the workbench and began reading. The first letter was from 2003, written by Virgil, addressed to a Dr. Constance Waverly in the engineering department at Hargrove State University. The tone was careful, humble in the way of someone who understands the social architecture of expertise and navigates it with precision. He described his work, the principles, the prototype he was developing. He asked if she might be willing to review his calculations. Dr. Waverly's response arrived, according to the date, 2 weeks later. She was intrigued. She asked for more details. She offered encouragement. And so began what the subsequent letters described as a collaboration. Freddie read through years of correspondence in the compressed time of a single evening, her coffee going cold on the corner of the workbench. She watched the relationship develop through the letters, Waverly providing feedback on Virgil's designs, suggesting refinements, helping him navigate the engineering principles he had taught himself imperfectly because there was no one to teach him properly. There was genuine excitement in the exchanges, the specific electricity of two people pursuing something they both believed was real and important. Then the tone changed. A letter from Virgil dated 2007. He was preparing a patent application. The prototype was nearly complete. He wanted to formalize his claim on the invention. Dr. Waverly's response was encouraging. She offered to review the application to provide supporting documentation from their years of correspondence. The next letter was not from Waverly. It was from the Office of Legal Affairs at Hargrove State University. Freddie read it twice. The letter informed Virgil that his proposed patent covered technology substantially similar to research being conducted within the university's engineering programs. It suggested that his application might constitute infringement on intellectual property developed through university-funded programs. It strongly advised him to seek legal counsel before proceeding. 3 more letters followed from the patent office, rejection letters, each one citing different technical grounds, each one arriving at the same conclusion: application denied. The final letter in the stack was from Dr. Waverly. It was short, the kind of brevity that happens when someone is trying to say as little as possible about something they know is large. She had been instructed by her department leadership to cease all communication with outside inventors. Her research was university property. She could not provide documentation supporting Virgil's patent claim. She wished him well. At the bottom of that letter in Virgil's handwriting, 3 words written in pencil pressing hard into the paper. They stole it. Freddie set the letter down on the workbench. She sat very still for a moment. Outside the workshop, through the barn's small window, the October sky had gone the deep blue of early evening. The work lamps made the workshop their own contained world, the blueprints on the walls, the device on the central bench, the box of letters that had been sitting behind a cabinet panel for years waiting. She opened her laptop and searched for Hargrove State University's engineering department. Their website was well maintained in the way of institutions that understand the importance of presentation. Research programs, faculty accomplishments, innovation highlights, substantial sections on energy research and sustainable power generation. The language was familiar not because she had read it before, but because the concepts it described matched what she had been reading in Virgil's blueprints and his journal for the past 6 weeks. She found Dr. Constance Waverly's faculty page. Full professor, a biography listing publications, speaking engagements awards for innovation in sustainable technology. Research that had received millions of dollars in grant funding across a span of years, beginning in 2008. She searched for patents held by the university, found 3 related to energy generation systems filed between 2008 and 2010. She read the technical descriptions carefully, moving between them and the photographs she had taken of Virgil's blueprints. The language of patents was not the language of working engineers. It was designed to establish territory rather than explain function, but she had read enough technical documentation to follow the concepts. The core ideas in those patents were Virgil's ideas, not identical. They had been refined, modified, extended, developed further by people with formal training and institutional resources. But the foundational architecture, the approach that made the system work, was the approach in Virgil's blueprints. The approach he had developed over years in a workshop on a farm that the county had given away as a raffle prize because no one thought it was worth anything. She looked at the device on the central workbench. The man who had built it was 5 years dead. He had died in this farmhouse not far from where she was sitting, believing that his work had come to nothing, that the years he had given to it had produced no result, that the laughter of the people around him had been in the end correct. He had been wrong about that, and the people who had made him wrong about it were the people he had trusted to help him. Freddie closed the laptop. She sat in the workshop in the silence of a late October evening, with the letters from the metal box spread across the workbench and the blueprints on the walls, and Virgil Kesik's nearly complete device in the center of the room, and she felt an emotion she identified precisely because she had felt it before in the warehouse, when she had discovered systematic errors in inventory records that someone had been hoping she wouldn't notice, when she had understood that the damage was real and that something had to be done about it. Anger. The clean, clarifying kind that does not require raising your voice. She stood up. She put the letters back in the box in their original order. She photographed each one with her phone. Then she set the box carefully on the workbench beside the device where she could see both of them at once, and she made a decision without exactly deciding it in the way that the most consequential decisions sometimes happen, not as a moment but as a recognition of something that has already been true for longer than you have acknowledged. She was going to finish the device. She was going to document everything. And then she was going to figure out how to tell the truth about what had been done to Virgil Kesik. The work on the device intensified in November. She had the components she needed now accumulated through the weeks at Fritz's hardware store, purchased with the employee discount and supplemented by 2 items she had found in Phyllis's late husband's workshop that matched specifications from Virgil's blueprints in ways that felt less like coincidence and more like the landscape arranging itself toward a conclusion. She worked with Virgil's journal open beside the device, treating it as the instruction manual it had been written to be. The copper coils at the device's heart were remarkable. She had recognized them as remarkable in the first week when she had still been in the documentation phase, not yet touching anything. They represented months of Virgil's time, thousands of precise windings, each one exactly where the blueprint specified, each one representing a decision made correctly in a sequence of decisions that numbered in the tens of thousands. You could not look at those coils and believe you were looking at the work of someone who didn't know what they were doing. The expertise they represented had been earned through repetition and failure, and the particular education that comes from having no teacher and no alternative, but to figure it out yourself. She installed the voltage regulator on a Wednesday afternoon, following the blueprint specifications with the patience that the task required, verifying every connection twice against Virgil's notes. The specialized capacitors went in on Friday. The final wiring run, which required her to work in the tight space between 2 components, in a position her lower back registered for the following 2 days, was completed on a Sunday evening in December, when the temperature in the workshop had dropped to the point where her breath made small clouds in the work lamp light. She checked every connection against the blueprints. Then she checked them again. Then she walked around the device, slowly looking at it from every angle, the way she had walked around a warehouse floor, doing final checks before a major audit, not because she expected to find something wrong, but because thoroughness was not optional. Everything was in order. On a January morning when the frost on the clearing outside the barn was thick enough to crunch, Freddie stood at the main power switch of Virgil Kesik's energy converter and placed her hand on it and did not immediately flip it. She thought about 25 years of systems, about the specific moment before you start a machine for the first time, before the performance of the machine confirms or denies everything the preparation has been working toward, about the fact that readiness is not certainty and that certainty is not available, and that the only thing you can do is prepare as well as you can and then find out. She flipped the switch. The hum started low, barely perceptible, the vibration of something beginning to move that had not moved before. It built gradually, finding its frequency settling into a sustained tone that she could feel in her sternum before she could fully hear it. The copper coils began to turn slowly at first. Then with increasing confidence, the rotation becoming smooth and regular as the system found its equilibrium. The gauges on the control panel came alive. Numbers climbed toward the ranges Virgil had marked in his specifications. Voltage rising, amperage stabilizing, frequency holding steady at exactly the value the blueprint required. The digital display showed outputs climbing toward and then reaching the figures Virgil had predicted, the figures that the university's patents had subsequently described in different language as the basis for their award-winning research. The system stabilized. Freddie stood in the workshop and watched the gauges hold steady and felt something move through her that she could not name with any single word. It was composed of too many things arranged in a sequence too rapid to parse. There was the technical satisfaction of a system working as designed, which she recognized from 25 years of successful audits. There was something larger than that, something she felt in a part of herself that had not been reached by that kind of professional satisfaction. Something that had to do with Virgil's voice in the journal, with the quality of care in those copper coils, with 3 words written in pencil on the back of a letter. She let the system run for 20 minutes, monitoring every indicator, taking readings, and recording them in the yellow legal pad that had become the documentation of her time on the farm. The performance was consistent. Nothing fluctuated, nothing stressed. The engineering was exactly as sound as the man who had written the journal had believed it to be. She powered it down after 30 minutes, following the shutdown sequence Virgil had specified. Then she sat on the stool at the workbench. She had brought a photograph of Virgil into the workshop some weeks earlier. She had found it tucked into the back of the journal, a black and white image showing a man in his 60s standing beside a piece of machinery, looking at the camera with an expression that contained, if you looked at it long enough, the specific quality of someone who is accustomed to knowing things that the people around them have not yet understood. She had set it on the corner of the workbench where she could see it while she worked. She looked at it now. "You were right," she said to the photograph. In the silence of the workshop, her voice sounded strange, not because she spoke often in that space, but because what she had to say was more than the workshop's usual vocabulary of technical problem solving. All of it. You were right all along, and you died not knowing it. She had not expected to cry. She was not a woman who cried easily. But she found that her eyes were doing something without her authorization, and she let them because Virgil had spent 30 years building something extraordinary in a workshop that his community had decided wasn't worth opening the door to, and he had died believing he had failed, and the device on the central workbench was turning his measurement of himself into a lie, and that mattered in a way that was not accessible to professional composure. She sat with her for a while. Then she wiped her face and opened the laptop and began drafting an email. She had found Dr. Constance Waverly's university email address on the faculty page. She wrote the email carefully with the attention she had given to every important communication in her working life, not accusatory, not emotional, simply factual. She explained who she was. She explained that she had acquired Virgil Keswick's farm and found his workshop in his correspondence. She explained that she had completed the prototype, that it was functioning, that it worked exactly as Virgil had described it would. She asked whether Dr. Waverly would be willing to speak with her about Virgil's contributions to the field of energy research. She read it 3 times. Then she sent it. She did not expect a rapid response. She expected, if she was honest with herself, to receive no response at all, or a carefully worded response from a university communications department designed to acknowledge nothing while appearing to address everything. The response came 4 hours later, from Waverly's personal email address, not her university account. It said only, "Can we speak by phone? I have been carrying guilt about Virgil Keswick for a very long time." Below it, a phone number. That evening, Freddie sat on the farmhouse porch in the cold January air, wrapped in her good coat, and called the number. The voice that answered was the voice of a woman who had rehearsed nothing, because some conversations cannot be rehearsed. They talked for 2 hours. Waverly confirmed everything the letters had suggested and added the dimension of institutional mechanics that the letters alone could not convey. The faculty meeting, where she had mentioned Virgil's work, the interest of the department head, Bernard Ashton, the sequence by which a genuine collaboration had become through a series of decisions, each of which seemed individually defensible, something that was not defensible at all. She described what had happened with the particular candor of someone who has been waiting for permission to say a thing they already know to be true. I told myself I was being practical, she said, that this was how academia worked, that Virgil would never be able to navigate the patent system, that if we didn't move forward, someone else would. She was quiet for a moment. I rationalized every compromise until I didn't recognize myself in the mirror. When Waverly finished, Freddie asked one question. If I decide to pursue this, to make what happened to Virgil public, to challenge what the university did, will you help? There was a pause on the line, long enough that Freddie counted it. Then Waverly said, I kept every document, every email, every internal memo, every meeting note from those years. I kept them because some part of me always knew this day might come. Tell me what you need and I'll provide it. I owe Virgil that much. I owe him considerably more than that. After the call ended, Freddie sat on the porch for a while in the cold dark. The farm was quiet around her, the barn with its workshop, the fields going silver in the moonlight. The 40 acres that everyone in Millington had laughed about when her name was called at the fairgrounds, and the people who had laughed about it, and the things that were stored in the laughed-at place that they had never bothered to look at. She thought about Phyllis's word, peace, the peace Virgil had never gotten to feel. She thought about what it would take to give it to him posthumously in the only form available, recognition. Truth. Someone saying clearly in a context that could not be dismissed what had been done, and who had done it, and what Virgil Keswick had actually built in his workshop on rural Route 12 in Millington, Indiana. She called Bryn, not a Sunday, not her usual time. She called because she had something to say, and she needed to say it to someone she loved, which was a need she had gotten out of the habit of indulging and intended to stop neglecting. Bryn answered on the third ring, the surprise of an off-schedule call visible in her voice. I need to tell you something, Freddie said. Something I've been working on since I moved to the farm. Something I think you should know about before I go further with it. And she told her daughter everything from the journal to the workshop to the letters to the device that had run for 30 minutes in a cold January workshop and performed exactly as its maker had always known it would. Bryn was quiet through most of it, not the distracted quiet of someone managing another priority, the quiet of someone listening completely, which was something she had not done with her mother in longer than either of them would have found comfortable to measure precisely. When Freddie finished, Bryn said, Mom, is this real? Freddie looked through the kitchen window at the barn, at the workshop inside the barn, at the device inside the workshop, sitting in the dark waiting. It's the most real thing I've done in years, she said.